Hmm. So even just now, of course, this is kind of impossible to avoid, but I saw more psychologically manipulative YouTube content specifically designed to smith a narrative like a blacksmith on an anvil. Your mind is the metal. YouTube is the anvil and the hammer. um, yeah, it was on a movie about a PTSD guy in Afghanistan. So this is fun for me because of the corruption of American society, but the wealth generated by capitalism. My self education has been far more effective and superior in terms of quality and quantity than mainstream academia. It's a good example of that. Judaism, and I don't know this for certain. I'm not officially converted. I want to convert. Jews don't make that easy. They're kind of jerks about it, but I still want to convert and learn Hebrew and read, the original Hebrew and Aramaic Old Testament rather than the Christian translation for a million reasons. But if this applies to Afghanistan, so Afghanistan right now, the narrative is that we killed Bin Laden in Pakistan, which means we had to stay in Afghanistan for 20 years. It's about the heroin, the opium, and not necessarily heroin, but Oxycontin as well, right? Oxycontin is legal heroin. This is how the plutocracy uses welfare to apply eugenics. The opiate crisis was effective population reduction, so is the fentanyl crisis. And marijuana assists with that. It's a causal component, a causal contributing component to the current circumstances of the United States and the world. My interpretation of the Tanakh and the Torah, which I haven't read completely, and I certainly haven't read in Hebrew, so I don't understand Hebrew fluently yet, modern or ancient, is the parable, for example, of David and Goliath, right? David Hamelech, King David. This also applies to the other parable of Amelech. So, for those who don't know, Melech is king. So, Hamelech is the king. Hamelech David is David the king. And when you had David versus Goliath, I see that, this is my personal interpretation, as a small nation defeating a larger, more powerful nation. Bob Sapolsky, an atheist scientist, Jewish, but even though he was born religious, he fell out of the faith, religion, says that you can see smaller groups outcompete larger groups because smaller groups with stronger in-group cohesion outcompete larger groups with more in-group competition. When David threw the stone into the head of Goliath, I took that to mean the head of the nation, the brain of the nation, the top position in the hierarchy of leadership. And a good example of this, say, if you want to control the Catholic Church, you don't have to control the entire church and all of its bishops. You just have to control the Pope, the one man they follow as the infallible word of God. If you want to control the Mormon Church, you don't have to control the entire church. You just have to control Russell M. Nelson as your puppet. If you want to control the United States, you control the president. This is why no matter who wins the election, both candidates work for the same boss. Trump, Biden, Hillary, they are all underlings of someone more powerful. This is how all wars are banker wars. So Amalek, to me, the parable kind of shows that, and this is again my vague interpretation, probably inaccurate, but that someone with more wealth can control a nation more than the nation's king. The banker has more control over the nation than the king. And the opiate wars are a perfect example of the Afghanistan war all over again. Excuse me. I think it was the 1700s. A Jewish banker in London, I think he was Sephardic, named David Sassoon, who owned the East Indian Trading Company. And by the way, you're welcome to fact check everything I say to falsify or validate my statement. David Sassoon was the one who dictated the British military to invade China to force opium on China. Sounds familiar, right? Yeah. He grew opium from Afghanistan to Cambodia and parts of India because Southeast Asia is the perfect climate for growing poppies. That was a big part of the British Empire. All these white supremacists who hate on Jews because they think that white globalism, European and British Empire expansionism is a solely European thing. Yeah, Jews were the ones who were doing fractional banking, who made that possible. There was Jews on the Mayflower or the Roanoke colony and stuff like that. It's Jews and whites will often try to blame each other for their own guilt, right? Externalizing accountability. They're both accountable for their own actions. But all of us are. It's not just whites and Jews. Browns, blacks, yellows, reds, you name it. But I digress. So this is happening all over again. Essentially, the bankers dictate the military, not the government. The bankers control the government with money. The guiding moral star is profit. This is why the military hasn't arrested any corrupt politicians the way they have in other countries. I think Venezuela they've done it, Malaysia they've done it, and so forth and so on. So in Afghanistan, the Sackler family, an Israeli family, this is not a moral condemnation, just objective analysis, use their control and influence of the military with their wealth, right? They have more power over the military's decisions than Congress, than the three branches of government, legislative, executive, and judicial. So just like David Sassoon all over again, they did it legally and with the military and police on their side to transport and distribute their heroin and protect their crops. That's what Afghanistan was all about. Social engineering, moral degeneracy by cultural conditioning. Right? And now it's marijuana, of course. Interestingly enough, even though marijuana was illegal technically for 60, 70, 80 years, since the 1920s, I think, cannabis-induced psychosis causing homicides is documented back to the 1400s. Muslims did it. There's books about it, along with suicides and things like that. People falling off of buildings and cliff sides under hashish, I think, was a big one in the 1400s, along with ending up in the insane asylums for hallucinations, believing they were animals and dead and all kinds of stuff. But for the past 60 years, even though it was illegal, Jewish Hollywood, straight up. It's kind of. I'm not blaming Jews for this. If you remove Jews from the equation, right, apply the scientific method, eliminate the cause, eliminate the effect with the cause and effect relationship, you eliminate the Jew from the situation, you still have these problems. People still do drugs, even without Jews to blame as drug dealers. But this is an example of the stone that flew into Goliath's head. Marijuana, it makes people more psychologically susceptible to manipulation, false memories, cognitive impairment, etc. Therefore, the population is pacified and easier to control, and you can do whatever you want. Which is what happened to me and my family in New Mexico. It was once a Spanish Catholic stronghold, and drugs were a corrosive, corrupting elephant from within. This isn't because of Jews. Mexicans do drugs on their own. If anything, the coca plant was first discovered by the English, and they were the ones to take it and turn it into powdered cocaine hydrochloride, right? So it's not like you can blame Jew on that either. But Jews are the lead of the economic structure. And this isn't all Jews. There is a lot of poor Jews who get screwed over by rich Jews. A good example of this would be the movie 38 Witnesses, or The Witness, which was about the murder of Kitty Genovese. I can't pronounce her name right. In the 1960s, I think it was like 1964 or 62, might have been 68, but it's where the bystander effect comes from. That this Jew who owned the New York Times published a story that this woman is murdered. A white Jewish woman in New York was murdered in a Jewish neighborhood by a black guy. And all these Jews watched her get killed, and none of them did anything. They didn't call the police. They didn't step out of the building and try to help her, etc. They just watched. All of them watched, thinking somebody else would do it. Is what the bystander effect is. You don't act because you think someone else will do it. He was lying. He threw Jews under the bus, even though he was a Jew, for money. It turns out that her brother, who survived, he had his legs blown off in Vietnam, went and tracked down some of the original witnesses and the original police records and stuff. No, they did help. They helped her. They called the police. They even pulled her in the building while she was bleeding and, locked the guy out or something like that. Yeah, no, they did act. But can't let the truth get in the way of a good story. This Jew who owned the New York Times, I forget his name, the media mogul, he ran the story anyway and straight up was more anti-Semitic in that act than any of the neo-Nazis in New York at the time. And he he didn't care. He cared more about money than Jewish unity, essentially. So this is an example of how profit drives anyone, Jew or Gentile, black or white, whatever. That greed, it seems to be the number one motivational factor in the United States. Like if you're honest and you want to be a good person, you're not going to be very rich. You can try to be, you can work hard and you'll get maybe middle class. But the way our system is set up, this cultural environmental stimulus shaping behavior with a series of rewards and punishments, dishonesty is rewarded with profit. So that sort of behavior is being cultivated. Sexual immorality, dishonesty, deception, disloyalty, etc. And you can see that in the military, right? Like in this video with the Section 8 was the name of the movie. It was like a quick rundown. You had the woman in the military and like gender diversity. I'm sure there's sexual orientation diversity, etc. And this is a perfect example of how they are using the internet, technology, social media, Silicon Valley to psychologically mold and manipulate the minds of the masses to believe lies and false narratives and etc. So forth and so on. Not that I'm condemning them. I mean, so my interpretation of this goes to World War II and World War One. My current understanding is that World War II and World War One were orchestrated by Jews to regain, ancient Judea as modern day Israel after 18 centuries. Now, a lot of Jews might say this is an anti-Semitic statement, but they won't say it's wrong. And I'm not just basing that on the book Jewish Eugenics, which does discuss a lot of, deals made with every, like America, Britain, Soviet Union, as well as Germany, in order to get Jews back, to give Palestine to Jews as Israel, basically. This is also reading on Moses Mendelssohn and his Hebrew writings. It seems there was a Haskalah movement, Haskalah, to where there was some Jews, some rabbis just wanted to assimilate into extinction. No more Jews whatsoever. Let's just intermarry. Let's get baptized in Christianity. Let's become the Gentiles. Let's just no longer exist as a separate, independent people. And the other end of the spectrum was no, no, no. We need to revive Hebrew. We need to revive Jewish culture, Jewish pride, Jewish unity, and we need a Jewish state. And that was also the final solution was, what are we going to do with all these Jews that nobody wants? That we got to put them somewhere. And that's where Theodor Herzl and the Jewish state, is all about. So I find that particularly impressive. Like some people will hate the Jews for that. If they think that World War II was orchestrated by Jewish communists like Marx and Lenin and Trotsky, but also Jewish capitalists like Warburg and the Federal Reserve and stuff like that, they're like, oh my God, that's terrible. It's applied eugenics. It was population reduction, right? 4 million Bengalis died in World War II. Never hear about them for some reason. Winston Churchill starved them intentionally. He used the British military to compensate their food, their rice especially, and so forth and so on. There was the organized famines of the interior of Russia, and hence why Ukraine had a huge anti-Semitic thing, was they were blaming the Jews, and it was largely Jews that were in the Cheka and the Kremlin, and things like that. But if you look at Chabad right? The Rebbe, not the original Alter Rebbe, but Rebbe Lubavitch, Chabad Lubavitch, his dad died in a labor camp in the Soviet Union. And that's why he didn't like the state of Israel. He rejected the state of Israel because he knew what I now know. And I don't know this to be factual 100%, but all the evidence points to this conclusion that Jews, very specifically Zionists, did orchestrate World War II, knowing that many Jews would die, and so would many Gentiles. Right? It's supposedly 6 million. I don't agree with that number, but even if you take that number at face value without exercising any critical thinking, there was still like 60, 70 million Gentiles that died in World War II. So if I'm to believe the planet's population is 8 billion and counting right now, if it wasn't for those applied eugenics through war, just like with Russia and Ukraine right now with the bioweapons experimentation, right? That's population reduction. Oh, my foot's giving me pain now. If it wasn't for that, we'd actually be more overpopulated. And this, I don't apply this ideology and values to others. I apply this to myself. So for me, my hereditary high IQ, 135, I think 138 maybe, is a reason to sustain my line and produce children. And, my genetics should go on to the next generation. But then my schizophrenia means that I shouldn't reproduce, and I don't want to reproduce in a world that is this awful. Why would I want to have kids in a world that's full of marijuana that's going to condemn them to the same suffering that I had to go through? That's just selfish and irresponsible. I am very morally conflicted on this particular topic because I want a wife, I want kids, I want family, but I don't want them in a society that is so morally bankrupted and corrupted as America is right now. And undoubtedly other parts of the globe are. I think that's a big aspect of globalization. You can say globalism is a conspiracy, but it's clearly not. We are globalizing. That is happening. It's been happening for decades. Economy is part of globalism. If you look at the moral pathogen, if you look at morality as a path, the social diffusion networks of moral contagions. The theory there is that ideas are like diseases. They transfer from person to person. And so, therefore, if you write them in a book, if you project them onto an electronic device like the radio or the television or movies or social media and the internet, etc., then the diffusion network of the pathogen has a wider spread. But if you rewind time back to, say, the first century AD, after the Common Era, if you want, um, these went along trade routes, right? So religions went along trade routes, like Judaism turning into Christianity. Buddhism also, like the river, right? It headwaters in India and then it flowed eastwards towards Japan, like a river. Its headwaters are in one country and its final destination is in other countries. This, sorry, my foot's really giving me a lot of pain. I'm losing focus here. This is a perfect example of how money is not inherently good or bad. It's how you use it. And so the morality of money is interesting because then you get into subjective morality in general. Like, is it more moral to use your wealth and power to implement population reduction, knowing that good, innocent people will be affected negatively, will be sacrificed, have their lives destroyed, etc.? Was it moral for the wealthy plutocracy Jews of World War II, like Warburg, who Daddy Warbucks is based on, to dominate the American Congress to approve funding to Stalin when German victory looked certain? Specifically because they knew that would get Jews killed, but that would also gain Palestine back as modern day Israel. So therefore, the ends justified the means, right? The sacrifice was worth it for the greater good. Very interesting stuff, to me at least. uh, mm. Anyway.